And this project, we're going to create a budget application. Now this project is going to be special because we're going to be using classes instead of constructor functions. So now let's look at what we're going to be creating in this application. Well, as you notice, we're going to have a budget. So whatever money we have, then whatever expenses we are going to accumulate, and what would be the ending balance. So let's say we have two forms. One is going to be for the expenses and the other one is going to be for the budget. Now, if I try to insert, let's say 5,000, and I'm going to press submit or calculate, I'm going to have a budget and the balance, because obviously there's no expenses yet. Now, if I would want to change the budget, and if I would say, you know what, I'm actually getting $2,000 more. So instead, I'm just going to say that this is going to be 7,000. You notice how automatically my budget is updated, and so is my balance. However, if I'm trying to insert the value that's going to be empty or negative, notice I'm going to have feedback and it's going to be complaining that it's not possible. And if you notice, the 0 hasn't been passed to my budget or to my balance. So once we set the budget, next is going to be the expense. So what would be expense? So let's say start with a fix a car. So I'm just going to say that fix a car is going to be $200. So now I have the budget of $7,000, still 7,000. Then expense is going to be 200, and the balance is going to be shown of 6,800 because we're going to take into account of expenses of 200. Now there's a couple of things that we can do. First, if we would want, we can get rid of expense. We can say, you know what, I don't need to fix the car. It was a mistake. The mechanic called and everything is fine. So I remove, and again, my balance is going to be to a 7,000 because I removed my $200 expense. But let's say that we have another rent, so another expense, and this would be a 2,000. So again, we're adding the expense, and you know what, just to show you that everything is working fine, we can have two of them. And next month came along, and we need to fix the car for $1,000. So again, we are calculating whatever our expenses are. So in our case, this is going to be 3,000. So now our balance is only going to be 4,000 because we are spending $3,000. And you know what? Our landlord showed up and he said, you know what, buddy, the rent is not going to be 2,000, is actually going to be 3,000. So now I can click edit and I can say painfully that instead of 3,000, I'm paying 3,000. I'm sorry, instead of 2,000, I'm paying 3,000. So I'm adding my expense and now my balance is even less because now my rent went up and I was able to edit it. And now these are all my expenses. And also, another bad news came in. My boss came in and he said, you know what, you're dreaming that you're getting $7,000 instead of you're, let's say, getting a 2,500. He says, I don't know what you were smoking, but there's no way you're making that much money. So I'm going to press calculate, and now my balance is actually negative. So now I need to reach for credit cards or something because my budget is a low of 2,500, or my expenses are way more. Now, obviously, we can add as many expenses as we want, and we can set our budget however high or low we would want. And depending on that, either our balance is going to be negative, which is in this case, or if our boss says, you know what, actually, we had a huge investor and now your salary went up again. So now we have a balance of 6,000. So like I said before, we're going to be using classes instead of constructor functions. So that's going to be really, really interesting. And like I said, yeah, enough of me talking, and let's start working on the project. The project setup files are located on my GitHub, so you can either go directly and just find by the project's name, or you can follow the link that I have left in the description of the video. Now, hopefully you downloaded a setup folder and you are as eager as I am working on this project. So whenever we have a download folder or setup folder available, we can just open it up and we can notice what we have regarding the HTML and CSS. Now, there's not going to be any functionality, so it doesn't matter what I'm pressing. You notice that I'm just going to be submitting the empty form, and I can just add expense, nothing is happening. And also there's no feedback, so I can click everything, but nothing is happening. So now this is our job to add JavaScript to this HTML and CSS. So we're gonna have a working app. So in this case, we can just maybe close it because we really don't need it. And let's open up this folder in our favorite text editor. Now, as always, probably for the 45th time, you're already hearing me saying that my favorite editor is going to be Visual Studio Code. However, you can use whatever editor you would want. Now I'm already skipping a little bit ahead. Notice we have the index.html where we're going to have the forms and where we're going to have our lists. And we'll have two types of form this time. Now in the main CSS, this is where our classes are. And notice that we were just selecting styles. So I'm just using a main styles and just applying them as a classes. And then we'll also have the app.js. Now, because this is a bigger project, you notice that there's quite a few things that I already right away added to the app.js. Now let me go over this just to make some clarifications. Well, first things first, prior to this project, we have been setting up a constructor function that was responsible for all our instances. So in this case, if we would want to have a constructor function for the UI, we created a constructor function, and then we added all the properties to a prototype. And if we had some other constructor function, and if we would want to add some type of properties in there, we added in a parameter, and then we set it equal to this. So this ID was equal to ID, and here we pass the ID. Now, like I said, this project is going to be different because we were going to make use of the ES6, and we have the class syntax. Now, the class syntax is with a class keyword first. So we need to have a class keyword. Then we would need to have the name of the class. And then this would be curly braces. So now again, we would use the variable. We're going to set it equal to a new UI class instance. And then we would be getting the instance of this class. Whenever we have class, we also have an option of having a constructor method that's going to run every time we're going to instantiate the class. And we have two options. We can either pass the parameters. Again, let's say that we would say ID. So every time we would be passing this ID, and we would say this ID. So for every instance, obviously this ID would be different. We'll just set it equal to ID. Or in our case, we're going to be using this constructor, and we're going to preset the properties. So I already know that I'm going to have property of this budget feedback. And I'm just going to use a document query selector, and I'm just going to set a budget feedback or expense feedback. And this is what I skipped. So I skipped all these selections because by now we for sure should have a good handle of selecting something. So I don't think that we need to write this for, let's say, 20 minutes because this should make all sense to us. Now, obviously, as I'm working, we will going to be switching back to HTML, maybe just to show you where exactly I'm getting this. But we already should have a good handle of this where we have the form. So if I have form, I obviously have the ID of budget form. So this is the form that I'm talking about. Then the budget input, the budget amount. So the input would be the input field. The amount is what I'm getting at. So the budget amount would be here, and so forth and so on. Now after that, since we have the constructor that we run every time we instantiate the class, this is going to be added to our instance. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to set up a methods on this class, and we're going to use this instance, and we're going to run the methods. Now most of our work we're going to be doing in the class. In fact, we're going to be just adding these methods to our event listener function, and then we're just going to be calling this function once the DOM loads. So let's do that first, because later on, only thing we're going to be doing is creating methods, and we're just going to be making use of the fact that we have access to these variables. To these properties. So this budget feedback, we can right away grab it. So we will going to be working with a function, and we're just going to grab this, let's say variable, or not variable, the property. We're going to grab this property, and we're going to make use of the property. So like I said, there's going to be two more things outside of this class. Now the first one is going to be the function of event listeners, and we would want to run this function as the DOM content loads. So let's make that other thing that I was talking about, and we would just say document add event listener. Now we're going to be listening for a DOM content loaded event, and once this event fires, we're going to have a callback function, and within this callback function, we would want to run this event listeners function. So this is going to be very straightforward, And once within this event listeners, we would need to create a new instance of this UI class. And then, like I said, we're just going to be listening for 3 events in this event listener, and everything else we're going to be doing within the class. So first, let's select 3 things in the event listeners function, because we will still going to make use of that because we're going to be listening for those events. And let's make a new instance of this UI class. So first things first, let's get a budget form. And we're going to set this into our variable of budget form. And again, we're going to do this by ID, get document get element by ID. And we're going to be listening or looking for a budget form ID. Now the budget form ID is the one with a green border. Now also we would want the expense form. So this would be this form. And here, obviously, we're just going to change this around a little bit. This is not going to be budget form. This is going to be expense form. And the last one is going to be the expense list. We're going to have a title and the expense value. So again, let me copy and paste this. This is going to be expense list. So here, let me delete the form, and also let me delete the list. So here, this would be a list. So we're going to have budget form, expense form, and expense list. So these are going to be my 3 variables that are going to hold the elements that I'm getting back from the DOM. Then let's create a new instance of the UI class. So instance of UI class. And if we would want to create an instance, we'd do the same thing as we're doing with a constructor function. So const UI, and this would be new UI. And like I said before, if we would be passing something in a constructor, since we're running this constructor every time we instantiate the class, we would pass it over here, like I did an example with an ID. So obviously for each and every instance, the idea would be that these properties would be different. Well, since I only have one instance and I just want these properties that would hold these DOM values on, I can just place them in a constructor without passing any parameters. So now, sure enough, I'm going to have access to all these properties, and more importantly, not just properties, to the methods that we're going to be creating here in the event listeners. And just be careful though, whenever you're working with a function constructor, you can place it anywhere. I mean, I can go 100 lines down and I can still have a constructor function. And because it is a function, this is going to be available to me anywhere in the document. But since this is going to be as a variable, then be careful, because you need to make sure that you declare it first and then you're making use of it. So if I'm going to use this, if I'm going to move this class UI somewhere down over here, you're not going to have access to it. So just be careful. And then once we have the new instance of UI, like I said, we would want to add 3 event listeners. One is going to be for the budget form. The other one is going to be expense form. And then we're going to have expense list. So let's do a budget form submit, and then maybe let's just create this budget form submit. So budget form submit, and add event listener. So we're going to be listening for a submit event, and then this is going to be our callback function. Now for now, we're just going to be passing the event, and we're just going to ignore everything because we don't really care. We haven't created these methods yet. So the only thing I want to do is just set up the bones, and so basically the structure of my event listeners function. And then once we're going to have the methods available, then we can start passing them, because otherwise this is not going to make sense. So this would be the expense form, and the third one is going to be expense list. However, the expense list, we're not listening for a submit. We're actually looking for a click. So click, because we're going to be attaching these events to expenses that we're adding. So whether this is going to be a deleting or editing or something like this. So this would be not a budget form, the second one. This would be an expense form. And I'm assuming that you already have watched quite a few projects already with me, or done quite a few projects with me. So since this is already last project on a objects, so I'm assuming you have watched quite a few of them. So I'm going to be skipping a few things ahead, so this is not like 3 hours long. So then let's do expense list. So we're adding the click event, instead of submit. So we'll have 2 submit events, and then we'll have 1 click event. Now, why I'm passing for the first 2 the event object, because we know with the form, this is going to be automatically submitting, and we would want to prevent that. So we would want to prevent default. So event prevent default, and we would want to run this method from the event object. And this way, this is not going to be resubmitting every time because we're preventing the default. So we're done with our structure. So now I'm glad to tell you that we can start working in our UI class of creating the methods. Now, the first method that we're going to be creating is when we are submitting the form. I would want to make sure that the value is not 0 or less than 0. And if everything is fine, I would want to show the balance. And I would also want to show the budget amount. So let's go ahead and let's start working. Now, within the classes and ES6, we can skip right now any kind of function, let's say declarations. So we can do only a comment if you would want to. So submit budget method, and we can just write the name of the method that we're going to be creating. So submit budget form. So this is going to be the method that we're going to be creating, and that's all we have to do. So now we have the method, and just to show you that everything is working, so we have a submit budget form. Now let's do console log and hello from ES6, since now we're using ES6, and let's go to budget form submit event, and let's run this. We have the instance of UI, and sure enough, we have what? We have submit budget form. And the only thing we need to do is just run this method. So as you can see, a lot of things are the same. However, this just makes a way more cleaner code, since we don't have to deal with the prototypes. We just have class, constructor that has all the properties, and now we can start creating the methods. So once we save it, let's open up the Google Developer Tools, because this is where we're going to be spending the next 10 hours. I'm kidding. Well, hopefully I'm kidding. And here, let's do calculate, since only thing we have to do is submit the form, and we have hello from ES6. And as you notice, nothing is refreshing because we prevented the default behavior. So far so good. Now this is great. Now we have the submit budget form method, then we can start working. Now, first thing, I would want to get the value. Now, where I'm getting the value is from the budget input, because this input of the form has the ID of budget input, and I already have assigned it to this, again, property. Now, again, with the first one, we're going to go back and we're going to look at index.html later on. I'm just going to assume that if you have issues, then just go back to index.html and you can find it. Now, you can press Command F if you want to find it faster. So let's say I'm looking for a budget input. I can just write budget, and the name would be input here. So now let's see that we have no values, because probably I misspelled it or something. So we have budget, this would be the name, and this would be the input. So budget input, and yeah, sure enough, because this was the class that I was selecting. I'm sorry, yeah. My property was with a capital letter because I cannot use dashes. And then if I'm looking for the ID, then I need to use the dashes. So therefore, if you're confused about something that you're getting at, you can use the Command F. However, make sure that you're not typing like this with my input that I was looking for. Instead of type with dashes, and everything is going to be fine. So what you're getting back from is this form group that is within the budget form. And then this would be the input. So basically, this is the money that we're adding in. So let's go back to app.js. And first, I would want to get the value. So const value is going to be equal to this. Now, since I have, again, access to the property, I'm using this. And now the name of this would be budget input, the one that I was trying to find with my Command F with the find. And here, let's just get a value. So what would be the value? Now, since we have done this quite a few times, I'm not going to console log it. We can just do right away value, and we can just check whether value is going to be empty, or, so here, this would be our operator. The value is going to be less than 0. So let's do less than 0. Now, if this is the case, then again, we have access to a feedback. Now, feedback is going to be showing I believe somewhere here. I mean, again, I don't want to go back to index.html because we can spend the whole day like this. So basically we have the feedback that I have selected and I have access to this feedback. So let's do this budget feedback. Now let's again use the class list. Now with the class list, we have an option of add or remove, or I believe it was contained. Now in this case, we just want to add show item because like with other projects, all we did is we created this budget feedback. I gave it in the main CSS of budget feedback and expense feedback display of none. And now I would want to add this show item. So this would be the show of block. So this is all we're doing. We're just dynamically adding this. So let's do add show of item. And also let's add some text inside here. So let's say this budget feedback, again, the same property. Then let's add as an inner HTML. And since we're using the inner HTML, we can pass the HTML tags over here. And for this, we're using the template literals, so backticks. And now we can just write that we would want to pass the paragraph. Now the paragraph would contain value cannot be empty or negative. So pretty standard what we have been writing before. So negative, then we can close the paragraph. And again, we're able to do this because we're using the inner HTML. You wouldn't be able to do this with the text content because then it's gonna, well, you would be able to do it, but this is gonna show the actual tags and this is not what you would want to do. So far so good. Let's test it out what we have. Now, as I'm submitting the form, I'm purposely gonna put 0 and now my feedback is gonna be showing. So now we selected the feedback and we added the class of show item. Now, obviously, again, like the previous project, we would want to hide it. After 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 10 seconds, I mean, I would want to hide it. Now, you could leave it. It's not a big deal, but I just always like to work with a bunch of functions in the project just so you get to know them. And I would want to hide it. I mean, long story short, let's just hide this. Now, how we're going to hide this, we're going to use, again, the set timeout, and we're going to have a set timeout. Now, this is going to be a function. Now, this function is going to require a callback function, and this would be the callback function that we're passing in. And then the second parameter is going to be how long this function is going to run. So again, let's do 4,000 seconds. And now let's do a this. Now we know that we have the access to a budget feedback class list. So budget feedback, and let's do class list and remove. So here we added this class to a feedback, and now we would want to remove the class. So the moment we're going to remove the class, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to go back to the default. And what was the default? Default was a display of none. So let's remove class, and the class is going to be the same of show of item. And I want to let you know right away, if everything is correctly, this shouldn't work. But let's just test it out. So once we run it, now let's again, I want to test with the 0 value. So now I run it, and interesting. I have the value cannot be empty. And after 4 seconds, I have some kind of error. Well, I mean, everything is correct? I mean, I don't know why I'm saying 2 times correct, but everything is correct. So we have this budget feedback class list. I mean, we had an access literally 1 line up. Now, what is the issue? Why we cannot access this? And again, the same thing like we had with a constructor function, we can make a great use of this, but we always need to be aware of it, what is actually pointing to. So if you have been watching the previous tutorials or projects, you know that there's an issue where at this moment, this is pointing to a global window object, and it's looking for the method on this, for the property on this global window object, and it's trying to add the class list. And it's saying that it cannot read this property because there's no such thing. There's no property on this global object, because obviously the property is on this UI. So again, we need to make sure that as we're running this function within this method, now within this method, still this is pointing back to the class. Everything is correct. However, since we're running this function within this method, now this is not pointing anymore back to a class. It's pointing to a global object. So again, we need to do something with a self, or you can name this really whatever you would want. So basically what you would do, you would say const And again, I'm going to use self, but you can write whatever variable you want. And I'm going to set this equal to this. So now I'm grabbing the value of this that is going to be pointing back to the class. And just to show you, let's do a log and let's do this. So in this case, let me show you what is this pointing to. Now let's also have a look at what happens within this function where this is pointing to, just so you don't think that I'm, I don't know, making this stuff up. And let's also console log this. So if everything is correct, we should have this that's pointing back to our class. Then we're gonna have this to the global object, and then self is again gonna be pointing back to a class. So let's check it out. Again, empty value, and sure enough, we have a few things. We have the UI, so this would be the UI. Now the second one is gonna be what? Now the second one is gonna be div over here, and then we have the third one that's basically not gonna make sense. So we have a div expense feedback alert, and then we're gonna have a on-call type error cannot read property of null. So obviously this wasn't working as we expected, even though we had the UI of feedback. Now this wasn't pointing to a correct way. Now obviously I cannot run these actually because I have run this after I called already this budget feedback. So this is not going to make sense. Let me fix this. This is why we cannot see anything. My apologies, because you notice the error runs and so we're not able to see this. So let's do this one more time. Let's calculate and let's see. It's more interesting what we have in the console log. So we're going to have a budget feedback. So we're going to have UI. This would be our first this. Then we're going to have the budget input. And sure enough, after 4 seconds, now we have the window. Notice this is the window object that I was talking about. So this is why we're trying to access it and we cannot. And next again, we have the UI. So like I said, we have the UI, then we have the window object, and then we have the UI. And again, I'm spending probably way more time than I should, but I find it really, really important whenever you're working with a JavaScript to understand what is this, because this is really helpful, but you need to know where it is pointing to. So anyway, long story short, we need to change this. So instead of this, we're just going to use self. So now we're reassigning this. So now in this case, everything is going to be working fine. And in 4 seconds, we're going to remove it. So again, let's go up. Let's say that this is going to be empty value. Now this is going to console log this. And over here, you can see that Cephal. I mean, this is not what I wanted. I mean, keep on making mistakes, but that's great. Calculate. Again, trying to add negative value. And in 4 seconds, this is going to be gone because everything is working fine. Now, after we have removed the feedback, now there's 2 more things that I would want to do. First, I would want to grab the value that I'm placing in the form and add it to the budget. And also I would want to remove and make this value empty, because obviously I would want to later on maybe pass some other value. So I don't want the value to stay there. And the third one is going to be show balance. And this is where we're going to be doing a little bit of calculation. So we're going to call another method that we're going to create in UI class. And like I said, most of the work is going to be in UI class. So I know that maybe this is going to be frustrating for somebody, but most of the work here is just going to be passing one or the other method. Now here we have one method, but then we're going to keep on adding other methods from the same class within this submit budget form method, because again, I find it important to understand how we are working with a keyword of this. So here, let's do a first budget amount. Now, what is budget amount? I'm selecting budget amount get element by ID. This would be the amount over here. So budget amount, then let's have it as a text content, and we're just going to pass the value. So if there is some kind of value, I want to pass it here. That's as simple as it gets. If the value is going to be 0 or less than 0, then I would want to show them or tell the user that they need to fix something. If the value is there, great, we're just going to pass the value. After that, I also, like I said, I would want to remove whatever I have in the input. So for this, we have a budget input property. Now, this is also going to have a value since we're selecting the DOM element. And this DOM element has a property of value since this is a form. This is important. So the forms have the value, and we're going to set it equal to 0. And the last one, we're going to call this and show balance. And again, for now, I'm not going to write anything in this function. I'm just going to call the function, and we're going to do what we did before. We're just going to write console log. Now, in this case, I have the this, and this is not inside some kind of other function that we're running here. So everything is fine. This keyword now is going to be, again, pointing back to a class. So now in this case, I can use this show balance, this.show balance, because I know that I'm going to be creating another method. Now the method is going to be, well, surprise, surprise, show balance. So now I have access to it. So now, again, like I said, we don't need to use any kind of function keywords to create it. We can just write show balance. And for now, we're going to do very simple. Again, console log, and we're going to do, hey, I am really, or I don't know why I'm doing like this. We can just do a backticks. So template literals. Hey, I'm getting a hold of this keyword. Well, I mean, this keyword, yeah, this keyword. And once I say it, hopefully I don't make like 10,000 mistakes with this keyword. Otherwise, this is going to sound very cocky. And you know what? Let me just comment out this. Now, keep it for your reference. And always, if you have any questions about this, one of the best ways is just to console log everything out. So let's add some value. Since we have tested already quite a few times with the zeros, calculate for 1,000. And now, sure enough, I'm running the method. So far, so good. Now we need to create the method of show balance, right? Correct? Because the first thing that we did was just call the method. So now we need to write something within this method. Okay, first things first. Now we have the method of show balance. However, like I said, this method is going to be interesting because from this method, we're going to call another method. So we're going to have const, and here we're going to write expense. Now here, basically, all I'm trying to do is calculate the expenses. And I'm going to create a method that's going to do this for me. So we're going to have total, and expense. As you notice, I'm not selecting the properties that I had on my constructor. I'm not doing that. I'm actually selecting a method again with this, the same as here. However, again, we haven't created the method. So here, let's do a this total expense, or to be more correct, we can just do comment of total expense. And let's write it. This is going to be total expense. So this is going to be our method. Now, again, we can do a console log just to check that everything's working. But I think that after a few times of doing that, this is becoming redundant. So we know that we're going to have access to it. And the way we're going to have access to it, that we're going to add this to the value. So basically, this method is going to calculate everything that we have in a list. Now, obviously, in our list, we have nothing right now. So right now, we're going to be working a little bit in the dark. So we're going to be writing a function that right now is not going to make sense. But the moment we're going to be starting adding the values, this is going to make way more sense than we think right now. And here, the basic idea behind this method is I would want to run through, I would want to calculate whatever items I have over here. And once I calculate items, I would just want to return them. So let's do very simple. Let's do let, and we're just going to call this total. Again, we're going to be using this later on. And let's just set it, I don't know, to 400, something like this. So we always have this value. Let's do very simple return of total. Now, again, like I said, later on, once we're going to have the actual values, we will going to make this functionality where this is going to make way more sense. But for now, I don't see the point of going through if there is no values really. I mean, just kind of, it doesn't really make sense. So let's add this. And now we know that this expense should have 400 because we have total expense and we're just returning the total. So good enough. We have a hard coded value of 400. Now next, we're going to be working with a total. So we're going to have const total. Now this is going to be the variable. Now here I would want to parse int. So I'm going to use this method that I have with parse integer. And the reason for that is because I would want to grab the value that's going to be in the budget. So whatever value has been passed in the budget. And again, remember, important thing, I'm only running this after I have added already in the budget. Now this is another stumbling point. Now we need to only call this callback whenever already there's some value. Otherwise, this is not going to make sense. You cannot get some value back from the DOM element if there's nothing there, if you're just running this function right away as the document content loads. So we need a parse integer. Now here again, we're going to use the property that we have, and we'll have a budget amount text content. So only thing I'm doing here I'm passing the value. So here I'm saying this budget amount text content value is equal to this value, and then I'm getting it back. So basically with the show balance, I'm getting it back. Now we could have set it up that I'm passing it as a parameter, or let's say here argument. I mean, we could have done a lot of things. So I just chose to do it this way. And again, don't judge me for this. Everybody can do however they want. So here let's do an expense. Now what is an expense? Now, like I said, later on, expense is going to make sense because we're going to be calculating all the values. For now, all we're doing is just returning the 400 since we're getting back this from the method. And now let's do this balance amount text content is going to be the total, because as you notice, I have the expression where I have the budget amount is going to be subtracted from the expense. And now I just want to show it. So whatever value I have in the balance. So this balance amount, again, this is a property that holds the DOM element with a budget amount. And let's do a text content that's going to be equal to total. So very simple. We just grab the expense that we're going to calculate later, but for now we have 400. Then we grab the budget amount, but since we're taking a text input, then we sorry, not text input, text content, I want to run it through the parse integer. So I want to get the integer, and then I would want to get whatever total I have. And now since I have the total, I use this balance amount text content, and again this would be a balance amount, so balance amount over here. And I would just want to check if this value is going to be less than 0, then we're going to show it with a class of red. So we're going to add a red color. And then else, if it's bigger than 0, then we're going to be green. And then last one is going to be if it's equal to 0, then we're going to have a 0. So let's write if and total. So now we're looking for a total. If total is less than 0. So what we should do? So we have a this balance and class list. Again, we first can find a class list, and then we're going to find what we have in the CSS. So we're going to remove show of green because I don't want to continuously keep on adding the classes. So basic idea is, since this is going to be changing, we can have more expenses, or we can have bigger budget or smaller budget. I don't want to keep on adding and adding and adding classes. So every time I'm adding the class, I want to make sure that I'm removing the other classes that I'm going to be adding. Hopefully this makes sense. And here we have this dot balance, and again this is going to be balance class list. And again, instead of removing, now we would want to add red. So whenever it is below 0, we would want to add a color of red, but we would want to remove the show of green of show of black if it was there before, because obviously we made it that this can always change. Now, two things. The balance is, again, the easiest thing is going to be finding balance. Now where we have the balance is going to be here. So we have the expenses, this would be 0, and then we have a heading 6 of balance, then the balance icon, and the actual class of balance is going to be where we have the $sign. So this is what's going to be turning red or green or something like this. So this is what we have. Now after that, in the main CSS, classes are very straightforward. Show red is going to be red. Show green is going to be green. Show black, I mean, we can guess. Is it going to be blue? No, it's going to be black. So let's go back to app.js and let's figure out. So we have if the total is less than 0. So now we have very easy task. So we can just grab this and we can just copy in first time. Here we're going to say else if, and if the total is bigger than 0, then we would want to do the opposite. We would want to remove show red and show black, and instead we would want to add show green. And after that we have one more where this is going to be equal to 0. And I don't know why, but looks like I copied 2 times. Hopefully, I don't know, I'm not just having some kind of I don't want to say heart attack, but some kind of brain freeze or something right now. Show red, show green. So with the 0, we would want to add the black one, show black, and we would want to remove what? We would want to remove show red and show green. Again, whenever class we're adding, the other twos we would want to remove. So this would be the show balance. Now, like I said, later on, we're going to still work on a total expense. So this would be the case right now. So let's save it and let's figure out what we have. So for now, there's not going to be any expenses. So this should be all green. Calculate, and sure enough, we have everything green over here. Now, if I'm going to have the adding on expenses, this, if everything is working correctly, this should be black. And I mean, we can just check it out with a black one. This should be black. With 0, this is black. So I think that everything is going to be working fine. Now, as we have the show of balance, now everything is working fine with a submitting of the form. Now, the next one is going to be really interesting, because then we're going to be working with an expenses. And this is going to be, well, let's just put it this way. There's going to be a little bit more code than this. So let's start in our event listeners, since this was a submit budget form. And the next one would be the expense form. Now, for the expense form, again, the method name is not going to be very original. Submit, and I'm not going to say budget. I'm going to say expense, because this is going to be the most original, probably, method name ever. Now here I have the submit expense form, and now I can save it. And obviously we need to go back, and now it's saying that there is a, well, now it's actually saying that there's a slow network, and it doesn't really matter to us. We're working locally, but now we had a what? We had a submit budget form. Now we need a submit of expense form, because this is going to be way more interesting. So after a show of balance, and we can just maybe leave this total expense all the way in the bottom. We can do a submit expense form. So this is going to be our comment. Now within this method of submit expense form, we were going to be selecting few properties, and we're going to be creating the variables. So first is going to be const expense value. Now expense value is going to be very similar to what we had in a budget. Now the difference is this is not going to be budget input, it's going to be expense input. We have expense input and an amount input. So whatever the actual expense is and whatever the amount for that expense is. So this dot expense input. And again, I suggest if you have confusion where we're getting this, you can use the command find, and you can just find the class that we're searching for. Const amount value. So amount value, and this is going to be equal to a input amount. So amount input, and again, we're going to use value. And again, since these are forms, we can use this property of value to get back the value. Now we really don't care what we're going to be console logging. If we really want, we can console log the amount value, but this should be straightforward what we're getting back. And again, this is going to be very similar to what we had before. So we're going to be checking for 3 things this time. So if expense value is going to be 0. So if you're passing something that, passing with no name, then we're going to have or. So in this case, we're going to say amount value. So amount value, and in this case, we're going to say this is equal to 0. And the last one is going to be if the amount is less than 0, because these, both of them are type number. So we can also put 0, but less than 0, but this wouldn't make sense if we're trying to actually set up our budget. So again, or operator, and amount value is going to be equal to less than 0. So if any of them are true, since we're using the or operator, again, we would need to work with this feedback. We would need to add the feedback. So this, in this case, this is not going to be budget feedback. This is going to be expense feedback. And again, this is set up in the properties of our constructor. So let's go down and expense feedback. Let's do the same thing we had before, class list. Now again, we're going to first show the item, and then we're going to add some text in there. So let's do show item. And again, the setup was exactly the same like we had with a budget feedback, where the initial was a display of none, and now it's going to show the item. So let's save this, and still it's going to be complaining about some slow network. And then we'll have expense feedback class list. Now after that, I would want to work with a inner HTML. So this expense feedback inner HTML, and then let's look at a template literal, since we can use the inner HTML, and we're doing the same thing that we had before. So we have paragraph values cannot be empty or negative. So this is going to be passing, and then since we're using template literals, we can just write whatever tags we would want over here. And again, since we're doing the same thing as before, we need to reassign. So we'll have const self, and this is going to be equal to this, because we're going to be calling the same thing, where we're going to have a set timeout function. Now this, like I keep repeating, this function is going to expect a callback function. Now this callback function is going to be run after a specific amount of time, which is a second parameter. Again, in our case, 4,000 milliseconds, which is 4 seconds. And since we already have covered the self and expense feedback, again, we're still accessing the class or the instance of the class, and we have a class list. And now in this case, we would want to remove. So remove, what we would want to remove? Well, it's simple enough. We would want to remove the show of item. So as we save this, everything should be working fine. And we're going to have, or we can just test it out. You know what? Let's do a first fix a car and add expense. And sure enough, we have a values cannot be empty or negative, even though if only one of them is. So you can already guess if both of them are going to be negative, then we're going to have the same thing. Now after that, let's do, you know what, let's do just the second one. So let's say that, or let's try, you know what, let's try adding a negative value. So here fix a car, and still we have the values cannot be empty or negative. So basically this is all we're doing. We're just checking for the values. Now this was a first code block for the if. So this was if. Now we need to else, because obviously there's going to be cases, or hopefully most times, there's going to be cases where all the values are there. So let's do another variable. This is going to be amount. Now we are getting back the amount value. Now the amount value we're getting back is again a string. So we need to use again parse integer. So we need to convert it. Otherwise this is not going to make sense. So we're going to have amount value, and we're using the parse integer. So now this variable is going to hold whatever amount we're passing in. However, this is going to be turned into number, not like we had before as a string. So here let's say this, and this would be an expense value. Now the expense input, sorry, not the expense value. And we're just setting again equal to a empty values. So if everything is fine, if we added the expense, I would just want to delete the fields. So deletes the field should be empty. And again, I have the access to the properties because of a constructor. And then this would be expense input. Then I have the amount input. So I have expense input and amount input, and they are going to be cleared once everything works fine. Then I also would want to set up first a object, and we're going to create an object, and then we're going to pass the object right here. Notice we have a item list, which is the array that we have. So I'm going to create a object that's going to contain the value of expense and the amount of expense, and also I'm going to grab the ID, and I'm going to add a 1 to ID. And before that, I'm just going to add it to a item list. So we're going to do a incrementation of ID. So first, let's create an object of let expense. So this is going to be our expense, and this is going to be an object. Now ID is going to be equal to what? Well, this dot item ID. Now where we're getting back the ID, well, if we'll scroll up, this is going to be our item ID. So this is where we're getting the ID. Now second is going to be what? This is going to be title. Title is going to be equal to expense value. So expense value is going to be here. We have access to it. So expense value. And here we have the expense value. Now for the amount, I would want to grab the amount, not the amount value, because remember, now this is a number. So amount, and this is going to be equal to amount. And just a quick note, technically with ES6, we could have just skipped this. If both names are the same, we don't need to add the property name and the value. If they both match, we can just skip it and just say amount, since we have the access for this amount. That's just a side note. And here we'll do a this item ID. Like I said, we would want to increment, and this is going to make sure that each and every item we're adding is going to have a unique ID. And then we're going to do the same thing as we did in the previous project, where we will grab the array, the item list array, and we're just going to add using the push method. And what we're going to be adding, well, the expense that we're creating. So whatever we have here, this variable, this object, be more precise, then we're just going to be adding. Now, after that, I would want to do two things. I would want to call two methods, again, which we haven't created yet. Now, the first one is going to be the add expense. So basically, display the expense. And then I would want to show the balance. So here we're going to call this first the add expense. And again, we have the access to it because we are within the method still. We are not within some other function. So this is going to point to whatever method we have. And this expense is going to expect a parameter of an object. So since we have the object, this would be our expense object, we're going to be passing in. So we're passing in this as an argument, but we're going to be expecting that in our parameter. So let's just make sure that we are outside the previous method. And let's maybe leave a comment just so I don't forget. We also have a show balance. I just don't want to create it right now. So we'll have a show balance. So once we create this, we have a add expense. So let's make a comment, add expense. And here again, this is going to be a method that expects to have a object. So add expense, and we can name this whatever we want. Again, this is a parameter. So let's just go with the same one as we had with an expense, but we can name this really independently. So again, we're going to create a div. And again, why we're creating the div. Now, if I'm going to go back to index.html, I believe this time I commented out. Notice we have the title value. First, we have the expense list. This is where we have all our expenses. Then this would be the title, and for the title value and expense title. And then we'll have a single expense. Now, each and every time, obviously, we're going to be adding this single expense. So the only thing we can do is we can just grab this div. This is going to be my single expense, because we're going to be doing a lot of things that we did before. We're going to create a div, we're going to add this class, and then we're going to place everything within this div. So actually, you know what? I'm selecting the wrong div because I only need this guy, because I'm going to be creating this parent div. I only need whatever is inside. So again, let me select this for a third time. You're probably sick of me watching do this, but const div. Then we're going to do a document, and we're going to create an element. So let's do create element. We're going to be creating a div. Now we know that this div is going to have a class of expense, because I just showed you. So we'll have class list of add expense. And just as a side note, you can really do however you would want, but I find it much more easier first to do it in HTML. Now, obviously, you cannot see it because I commented out, but in general, you make it in HTML, then you apply the classes. And then at the end, you can just comment it out and add it with a template literal. And I think that this is the fastest and best way to do this. Now, again, this is just my opinion. I'm not saying that I'm right or wrong. I'm just saying what I prefer to do. You really can do however you would want. And let's just copy and paste this. Now I have the expense ID, and also here I have the expense ID. Now where I'm getting the expense ID, I'm getting back from the object. So it's as simple as that. Now I could have left these empty, but for now, we already have done so many projects. A lot of things are making already sense where we're getting this from. I'm getting back the object, and I just want to have access to this ID. And I'm going to add this to a attribute of data ID, to a edit icon, and to a delete icon. So basically, every time I'm going to be clicking icons, I want to know the ID, because this is going to help me to filter out the list that we're creating and to make sure that we're getting the proper element and we're deleting the proper element. Most importantly, deleting, I guess. Well, editing probably is also important. Well, so we have the expense ID and expense ID. We also need a title, and we need an amount. So let's find out where we have the amount. So first, this would be a amount. So again, we are using a template string, so we can access the variable with a $sign expense title here. And then, no, you know what? This was the amount. I don't know. I am maybe having some kind of brain freeze right now. Title. It's right here. Good one. Good going. Again, we use $. I don't know why we had the no, you know what? This was this is the wrong $sign, so this is fine. Or you know what? No, it wasn't. Sorry. Sorry, I apologize. I just keep on seeing too many $signs right now. Expense title. This is what we need. So expense. This was going to be our object, and then we'll have a title. So once we saved it, now we obviously need to use some kind of method to append this to something. Now, since we're working within our class, the method has access to what? It has access to this property. Now this property holds the value. The value is what? The element that we're getting back from the ID. Let's scroll down. Let's look where is our method. Then this would be this expense, and we would name this expense list. And we're going to do the method of, guess what? Append child. And what we're appending, well, I mean, we can spend half an hour thinking about it, but I would probably say the div, since we created the div. But I mean, we can append whatever we would want, really, but let's just do the div. I think it's going to make a little bit more sense. So we have the budget complete. We have the expense complete. I guess we're done. Nah, probably not. We still need to fix some things. So we have fixed car 400 at expense. Boom. Fixed car 400. Great. Why nothing is showing here? Well, we haven't done anything, right? So that's why nothing is showing. So fixed car 400. Awesome. Now we still have an issue here. Why this is not empty? I thought we were working on this. We had the expense input was supposed to be empty. Now also we had the amount input that was supposed to be empty. So let's figure out what is an issue, why we don't have the proper way of doing that. And the reason that is because we need to select the value. So for now, we're just targeting the whole input. See over here, we have the input. Now this is why it's important whenever we're working with a forms, we need to use actually value. This is kind of crucial. Otherwise you can see what's happening. We cannot get the value if we would be getting the value, or we cannot set the value. Now in this case, we're setting the value. So let's try again. Let's try the fixing the car. Maybe let's do this time 5,000. And sure enough, everything is fine. We cleared it. And I want to say boom again, because we added an expense, and I can keep on adding as many expenses as we would want. Now, like I said, the second one that we are interested is showing the balance. So again, this would be the method that we're interested. So we have a show of balance. Now, if you remember, we already had this one time show of balance. And remember, the reason why we did not want to run the expenses is, or add anything to the expenses that we were creating, is because there was no values. So I think now it's going to make a little bit more sense if first we're going to add this show of balance, the method that we already worked before. And again, this method is what we used clearly when we were working with a budget. So nothing has changed with this method. So we can have the same method. So this show balance. And now once we run this method, then something should happen. And that something is going to be, first of all, budget. So 5,000, calculate, then we're going to have a 4,600. And again, the reason for this 4,600, because we run this show balance and we have hard-coded the values. So every time I'm going to be adding this fix a car, nothing should be changing. Yeah, you notice nothing is changing even though I'm running this. So we need to go and fix this total form. Otherwise, this is not going to make sense. Total expense. I'm sorry, we have total expense. So we need to fix this. So first, let's set a amount equal to 0, because this is going to be our starting point. Then I would want to check if the item list length. So the item list is the element that holds all the items. So if there's more than one item, I want to start calculating this. If there is no item, I don't want to calculate anything. So here I'm going to say like this. I'm going to say if this, and I have access to the item list because it is in my properties. Then I'm going to calculate if the length of the item list is bigger than 0, then I want to do something. Other than that, I wouldn't want to do anything. Other than that, I'm just going to say very simple. I'm going to say this, and now I'm going to use the expense amount. It is going to be text content. So again, we have the budget amount, we have the balance amount. So this would be the expense amount. And we're just going to set it equal to total. So all I'm saying is if there's no list items in expense list, this should be 0. There's no reason for it to be anything other than 0 because we haven't added any expenses. And last thing, I also would want to return the total, which would be 0. So this is all correct. However, we need to add the logic where we have the item list length is bigger than 0. And what we're going to do over here? Well, it's going to be very simple. We're going to have a total. Then we're going to set it equal to this dot item list. So we're going to have a item list. Now what we're selecting this item list for? We're going to be selecting so we can run the method of reduce. Now, why we're running the method of reduce? Because we want to calculate the values over here. So this is all we're doing. We just would want to get the values that we have over here. So first things first, maybe in this case, you know what, let's run the console log just so we can have a better understanding of what's happening. So let's do a console log of what we have in the item list, and let's add some items just so we can see what's happening. So we're gonna have item list over here, and let's just console log item list, and let's do again fix a car 300 adding once, and item list is actually not defined. We have 019. Well, that yeah, obviously because we need to use this. I'm selecting the this again. So let's do fix a car 300 add expense. So notice empty array. Okay, so why I'm getting the item list? Well, the reason for the item list is very simple. The item list is our array. So every time we're adding something in the item list, what do we have? Sorry, I said empty. It's not empty. We have one value over here. Sorry, I misspoke. But the idea is every time we're going to be running this and we're going to be adding this to a item list. Remember the item list.push. Now we have access to it. This is the whole purpose of the creating of array. So what I would want to do right now, if the length of this array is bigger than 0, I know that there's some items. So only thing I'm doing is I'm just going to use the reduce function, and I'm just going to count all the values for the amount property, because I know that I'm setting all my amounts to all the objects that I have. So let's do another one. Just again, I don't know, buy milk, something redundant, buy milk. And what would be the expense? I don't know. Let's say milk went up the price and it's $200. Two items, perfect. Again, amount 300 and 200. So again, the idea is I'm not going to be looking this in a DOM. I have access this in the array. So the only thing I'm doing is just getting my reduce method that I can use, and I can just count all these values together. That's all it is. So let's do again total. Now we're going to set this total equal to what? We're going to set this total equal to reduce. Now, unlike the, I believe, for each and the filter and the map, this is not going to, it can return more than just, or not more than just, not just an array. It can, using the reduce method, we can return whatever we want. So in our case, we just want to return 0. So the number, I'm sorry, not the 0, we're going to start with 0, just the number. We want to return the number. So let's do a reduce. Now reduce function is again going to take a callback function. And this callback function is going to take two parameters. Now, a lot of times they're called accumulator and current. Now you can really name them however you would want. But again, I'm just going to use the accumulator and the current. Now we can also set it, maybe this one to total. Then this would be a function block. So the callback function block. And then for reduce, we need the initial value. So this is where I was saying with 0. So all I'm saying is I can write here whatever I want. I can write array, I can write object. However, what I'm looking for is number, because I'm setting this total to number. So each and every time I'm going to be adding these values, I would want to get the sum of it and display whatever I'm getting back, and also calculate my balance. Now, how do I do this? So first of all, whenever we're using the reduce, we need to return the accumulator. So what needs to be understood that every time we're running this reduce, we were going to loop to this array and think of this as a total that it's going to be returned each and every iteration. So we have access to this accumulator. And we're going to probably maybe let's do some console logs just so it gives us a little bit better idea. But here, let's do first a console log, and let's do a console log of accumulator. So let's call this, I don't know, I mean, this is not totally correct, but let's say just total. And let's do template strings. This is going to be a little bit easier. So total is, now we're going to access the accumulator. So first let's look at a accumulator, and then let's say, and the current value is, and now let's do again access the value of current. So let's do a first of console log. Then let's do right away our whatever logic we would want. And here all I'm saying is that with each of iteration, I would want to grab the value that I'm accumulating, and I would just want the add the current amount that I have. Now, why I'm getting the current amount? Because I'm looping through this array item list. Now, the item list has the items of objects, correct? So current reflects the object. Now, where I have the value in the object, I have the in amount property. So this is why I'm going to say current. So current object that I am iterating through, that I'm using in my iteration, and I would just want to add the amount. And like I said, last thing, remember always return the amount. Otherwise, I'm sorry, the accumulator. Otherwise, this is not going to make sense. So let's save this. And now we're going to run this every time we're going to be adding values. So I'm sorry, I'm going to be sticking with fixing the car because it's saved here and it just saves me typing. Add expense. Now I have the total is 0 and the current value is an object. Now notice, because I made a mistake, I'm not looking for a current. I know that this is going to be an object. I need a amount because this is what I need. So this is what I'm saying is, as we're going through this, we're getting these values as an object because we have stored them in the item list as an object. So again, let's do fixing the car for the 45,000th time. So here we have total is 0. So we start with 0 and the current value is 400. Now, what do you think here the amount right now is? Because we added this 400. This should be 400, right? So in the next iteration, we're going to start. The total should be 400 and the current value is going to be something. So let's try this out. Let's do another fixed car because we really don't give a damn about it, whatever name it is. And let's just add 100. Add expense. Notice the total is 400. The current value is 100. So this is going to be added again to a 400. The next iteration, we're going to have 500. So this is how we're getting back the values. And I mean, the reduce function is extremely powerful. I mean, this is one of those things. If you want to learn something, learn reduce, because this is going to save you tons of time. It really, one of the, in my opinion, one of the most, definitely out of all the array methods, the most powerful method. Let's save this. Now we have the what it was, total expense done. So now it kind of made a little bit more sense as we were adding the values. And now we need to figure out what we're doing. So we have everything set up. So we have submit expense form and we have the balance. And if I'm correct, everything is working correctly, right? So we're going to have a 5 grand. We're going to calculate and we're going to fix a car again. We're going to have a 2,000. So everything's fine. So we have 2,000 and the balance is 3,000. So if I'm going to change this to a grand, now this should be expenses is still going to stay 2,000, and now the balance is going to be negative 1,000 because obviously our budget is 1,000. Now we have the submit expense form done. Now the last one is going to be working with these icons, with a edit icon and with a delete icon. So let me go up and let me show you what I have. So now I would want to select them somehow because I still want to have a functionality. I would want to remove it, or meaning delete it, or edit it. And edit it is going to happen like this. Again, we're going to remove it from the DOM. We're going to remove from the list, and then we're going to place the item here. So if you want to edit, then we can be able to edit. If we just want to remove, we're just removing. We're just deleting from the DOM and from the item list. Now, this we're going to set up within an expense list, because as we're added, again, we could have technically done this as a callback function as we're adding the items here. But in our case, we're just going to do a event propagation where we can just use the event target. Now, this would be another option. Again, it really doesn't matter how you do it. I just, for the sake of the tutorial, I just thought that if you do another callback, that might be confusing. So let's just skip this and let's do it with event listener. So only thing we're doing is, since we don't have an access to it normally, since we run the function, because the items we're adding dynamically, I would want to do the click handler. I would want to attach the listener for a parent. The parent is going to be expense list. So anywhere I'm going to be clicking on expense list, I would want to get back what I'm clicking on. And the moment I found out what I'm clicking on, then I would want to do some kind of action. So this is going to be happening in the event listeners. Now, again, we can do the simple event target. And I don't know why I'm not actually doing the event. Why I'm so brave. I'm trying to find the event target without actually getting the event. So we need the event object first. And then let's do again a console log of target. And this is going to, because this usually clears everything up, because event and event target sometimes can be a little bit misleading. So we always can do a console log. Now, obviously, this is not going to make sense. Now I'm pressing on the titles. This is not what I want. What I would want is get back the element that I'm clicking on once we have added the items. And this is, like I said, we can do dynamically, because there's no way for us to select those classes. Just, I mean, there is with a callback, but not, let's say, not to write a function here where you're going to be clicking, where you're going to be looking for the edit or delete item class. 500 at expense. So now this is more interesting. Now we have the expense, expense is $500, and now we have these two icons. This is what I'm looking for. So I'm looking for this icon of edit, and in fact, I'm actually looking for the element, not the actual icon. I'm not looking for the icon. In fact, I would want to get a link that is a parent of this. So we're actually going to be using, again, the parent element property. And the second one is going to be the trash icon. So this is all good. We just need to use the parent element because the parent element has the class. So this is the case where we're going to be going back to a index.html, and notice what I have. Now, we could have looked this in ob.js since we're obviously adding them. But anyway, we have the edit. This is the icon that we're getting back. What I need is this edit icon. I want to make sure that the parent element of the element that I'm clicking on has this class, because then I know that I'm selecting this icon or delete icon. So these are the two icons that I have, so I should be listening to it. And the way we do this, we use the parent element. Now, again, we have done this before, so we're not going to be going crazy with the console logs anymore. We can just use a parent element console log, not console log, the property. Now, if you have confusion about this, again, I suggest just console log out the event target parent element, and everything is going to be way more clear than if I spend another half an hour explaining this. So we're going to have a target, and like I said, we are looking for a parent element. Now, what is the parent element? This is going to be a link. Now, the link has what? Link has class. Now, the way I access the class, we can use the class list property. Now, what class list we can use? We can use contains. So what contains? Contains offers us to check whether this element has the class of whatever we're writing here or not. So again, this is really useful property of class list and obviously of contains. And now we're looking for the edit icon. This is obviously what we want as one option, and the second one is going to be delete icon. Now here I can do the if, so this is going to be my first if, and then we can just do the else if. So let me just grab, copy and paste this, and here let's say else and if. Now I'm not going to be looking for edit icon. This is where I'm going to be looking for a delete icon. Now what do you think we need over here? We need some function, because obviously for now we're just all we're saying is, well, if it is or if it's not. I mean, we can write something here, that might be fun, but we need a function. Now what is the function? Well, we can get the function from the method of our class instance, right? So we can do UI, then let's write what method we're going to be creating, edit, and we're going to write expense. Now this method, again, I created obviously before, and this expense is going to take one parameter. And that parameter is going to be the parent element, so basically a link. So here we're going to do the same thing. So if we're looking for the element that has the class, I also would want to select the same element. So I'm just going to use event, target, and parent element. That's all I'm doing. So I'm basically getting back the link. Now this would be the edit expense, and the same is going to be for the delete expense. Now here we're just going to use a different name. So delete expense, and again the same thing. It accepts the parameter of event, target, parent element. So some kind of object, or my apologies, some kind of element. Now obviously since we're working with DOM, we're really going to be getting back an object. But now we will gonna go up again to a class. So total expense was our last one. Then I don't know, either underneath or above, it doesn't really matter, whatever it makes sense to you. It's sometimes it's hard for me to decide for the tutorial where to place everything. Yeah, we just need to create these methods and we're done. Now these methods might be a little bit lengthy, but we're going to be fine. Edit expense, the name of the method, expense and expense. So first of all, I need to learn how to properly write everything. And here, this is the element. So this is the element that I'm getting back. Now, obviously, this is a parameter, and here this is an argument. There, I'm expecting the element. Here, I'm passing the element. Now, the second one is going to be delete expense, where I'm going to do the same thing. We're just going to write delete expense, and again, we're going to pass the element. So some kind of DOM element that we're getting back. And first, you know what? We're just going to write first edit expense. This might be a little bit longer, and then we'll have a delete expense. So we're almost there. I mean, we have pretty much two methods that we need to work on. This is going to be a little bit maybe probably complicated than before, but delete expense. Now, comments done. The method's done. Great. So let's work on it. Remember again, we had the ID, correct? Remember we passed this ID. So we're going to make use of this ID. How do we access this attribute? Well, we need to use dataset. So we will use a dataset, and we're going to access this by using dataset.id. Now, this is important because, again, this is going to help us tremendously, because otherwise, then we really need to do a lot of a DOM traversing. So we need to have access to this ID. Now, how do I have access to this ID? First, I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to set this is going to be equal to ID. Then what I'm going to be getting back is going to be string again. So again, we're going to use parse int. So parse integer. Now, what I would need element. Now, element has what? It has the data ID attribute. Now, I could use a data set, like I said, property. Now, for the data set, only thing that matters is what name it is. Since this is data ID, I'm using data.id. Because I couldn't write like this. This is not going to make sense. I need to write it as a object property. So I'm getting back the ID. Then I'm going to work with a parent, and I'm going to remove this parent from the list. Again, why am I getting the parent? Because look at the expense list. I have the expense list, and I need to go up the DOM, or traverse the DOM, all the way up to the expense list and make sure that it deletes whatever parent element of my icon. Now, it's not going to be direct parent element, because notice again, the icons are sitting within a div, then this div is sitting within something. So we need to kind of hop up to the DOM, get to the proper parent element, and just delete it. And trust me, whenever you're working, this is a lot of pretty much console logging. You're just, okay, parent element, okay, what is the parent, okay, next parent element, okay, now I got to the point where I need, okay, let's just get this sucker out of this expense list. So let's go up, and again, we're just going to be doing very simple. We're going to say let parent, and now we just need to hop few steps up. So the first one is going to be element, so I'm getting back the element, then I'm getting back the parent element, and again, if this is confusing, just console log it. It's going to make way more sense. So again, another parent element, another hop on, above, then another one. So basically we hopped 3 times. So we'll have a element, whatever element we got back. But remember, already within this element, we did the parent element. So technically we have 4 hops. We were doing first here with the parent element property, and then we're doing 3 more. So we have element, 1 more, 2 more, and 3 more. So here we're selecting the parent, which is actually this whole item. And then after that, we would want this expense list. So the list that's holding all the items, we just want to remove it. Now we know that we can remove it by first probably is going to make sense if we're going to adding a from DOM, the comment, this expense list. This is the grandfather of all these elements. You can call it like this. Now, obviously, such thing doesn't exist, but let's just call it grandfather. And we just want to remove the parent. So wherever parent we're getting back, we just want to remove from the expense list. Then the second one is way more interesting. This is, again, using the filter where we would want to remove from the array that we had. Remember, even though we remove it from the DOM, we still have this in the array, because remember we placed the item whenever we had the expenses. So remember we had the item list. Now I also would want to filter this out, and I would want to filter out for 2 reasons. First, I would want to filter out so I get the value, so I can place whatever I have within the item, let's say the value and the amount, so I can edit it. And the second one is I would want to return the array without that item. So first things first, let's get the value, my friends. So we have the remove from the list, and we have completed already remove from the DOM. Remove from the list. Remove from the list. And I'm sorry, sometimes it's hard to talk and type, so sometimes I'm going to talk and I'm just going to stop and type. So let expenses, expense. This item list, again, this is the array that holds all our values. Now we can use the filter to find. And what we would want to find? Well, we would want to find the item. So we'll have a function, the item that has the ID. Has the ID of this ID. So whatever item in our array that has this ID, we would want to return it. And we would want to return it to this specific variable. So here we're going to have item. But remember, the filter is going to return the new array. So again, we're going to have to select a 0 parent. So not 0 parent, sorry. I've been talking about parents too much. 0 item. So 0 index item, not just, this is not going to return the variable. This is going to return a new array. So callback function. Now within the callback function, we're iterating through the whole array. And I'm going to say like this. If the item that I'm iterating through, so that exact item in my array, if this item ID matches whatever ID I'm getting back from my element data set, then I'm solid. Then I just want to return this. If not, then I just move on. And in the perfect world, if everything is correct, since all the IDs are unique, this should return only value. There should be no other value. So first we're going to get expense. Now the second one is we would want to work with a rest of the list, correct? Because we have a one that is the item. And the second thing we need to remove this item from the list, at least temporarily. Because what is the point of editing if it was going to be adding a new value? So how do we do this? We're going to say remove from the, why I'm saying list is DOM. Sorry, list. Remove from the list. And again, we're doing filtering. Now, what is the filtering this time? Now, I'm going to set a variable. So I'm going to say let, and this is going to stand for temporary list. So temp list, again, name this whatever you would want. So this item list. again, selecting the same array, again, using the same filter. Now this time I don't want to return this one item. I don't care about that. I already got the item. I'm fine. I would need the rest of the list. And then I'm going to use this temp list and I'm going to assign this to my list that I have right now. So filter, again, callback function. Within a callback function, the parameter refers to every item in the list. And here we're going to say return. And I only want to return what? I want to return the item that does not have the same ID. So rest of the items that does not have the ID. So that ID can stay in the original list, but in the temporary list, we're just going to remove all the items that don't have that ID. And now it's very simple. We're just going to say, you know what? Since we have this, we're just going to say this item list. So whatever original list we have, we'll just reassign it. And we're just going to say temp list. Bam, here we go. So now this item does not exist anymore, at least in a list right now. Now, once we're going to again press add expense, once we have added, everything is going to be fine. However, right now, we don't want it. And also what we would want is we would want to show the balance. Because remember that every time we're changing something in a list, we would want to run the show the balance. Otherwise, we're going to be updating something and this is not going to show up over here. So we're going to run the add of balance. Show the balance that we had before. And now we have the item list and this will be the temp list. Now the last thing, I just want to add the values here. Because remember, as I'm editing, I would want them to show up over here. So again, we can do this in the bottom. We can do this after we have selected the item. It doesn't really matter. Here we're going to say show value. And remember what I was saying with the filter. The filter is going to return the array. So if I want to access this item, because I know this is an object. Now obviously because I placed it as an object, so I'm getting back as an object. But it is an object as a 0 index in the array. So now I'm just going to say this expense input. Now this is I'm getting back from the selections with the properties value. And we're going to do expense. Since this is what I'm getting back, 0. So 0 index value. And here we're going to say title. And again, we can do a bunch of console logs here alone. But just to skip a little bit ahead, let's just do this without console logs. And if you have any issues, again, you can just console log it and you'll see what I'm talking about. So we'll have a expense. And now instead of title, I would want to select the amount. So this is all that's happening. So we have the expense, which is an array, which is going to hold one object. And again, you can console log it and you'll see that what I'm saying is true. And then we're going to be getting back the titles over here. So let's at least test it out. So everything is working. So let's do a budget of $5,000. Let's calculate, fix the car for a 33,000 time, adding expense. Sure enough, we have 300. So this is going to be 4,700. Now, if I'm going to click edit, what's going to happen? Notice first I'm getting the values back. So this was the last thing that we did. Expense 0.title. Great. So we have these values. Now, also we removed from the expenses and now the balance is back to the 5,000. So again, this was the reason for the show of balance that we were running. And if I'm going to change this expense to, let's say 800, boom. Now I have the fix the car is going to be 800 and everything is calculated directly. Now the last thing is the delete expense. So delete expense. However, the good news is a lot of this is exactly the same. So we can do first of all, they're removing the parent. So this is going to be exactly the same. We just want to remove from the DOM. So let's just copy and paste it. Then, I don't know why I've removed from the DOM twice. I guess I messed it up again with my comments, which is pretty typical. Remove from the list. This is not from the DOM. List, we're removing from the list. And again, we're going to do the same thing. We're just grabbing the items, whatever we have, remove from the list, temp list, ID, again, temp list, and reassigning and showing the balance. That's it. So the deletion is actually very simple. We can just fix it in like, 30 seconds without me. Well, imagine without me talking. That's what I'm talking, 30 seconds. With me yapping, this could be another 3 hours. Yeah, so I think everything works correctly. And I want to feel brave and I want to actually open up in the browser Now I'm probably going to regret this because there's going to be a mistake and you're going to be laughing like your heads off. But anyway, yeah, let's test it out. So we have the budget. Budget is great. I mean, it's great if you're probably positive, not negative. But anyway, 5,000. Great. Awesome. 5 grand. You know what? Let's do 10. 10 is even better. Let's add 0. Well, no way, buddy. Okay, expenses. Let's start with the 0. Let's say there's no expenses. Well, that's not possible. Okay, fixing the car. But you know what? Mechanic actually paid me. No way. Didn't pay you. Let's do maybe negative budget because I forgot to do negative budget. Again, yep, no can do. Awesome, great. Everything is working fine. We probably, you know what, we should, now we're going to leave. We could technically add input where it's 0 right now if we add the incorrect value, but I don't think it makes sense. So we have fixed car, let's just leave it. So let the user actually fix it. If it's his mistake, then he should fix it. Now I have fix a car. Remove from budget, blah blah blah, budget 99979, expense value is 21. Let's add another one. Let's do the same of the buying of the milk. Buy the milk here. Buy the milk. Again, what, 300, 3,000. Let's make some fun milk. Expenses, budget, balance, bam. So 6979. And yeah, so we have expense value. What we can do, we can delete. If we want to delete, goes back to 21. If we would want to edit, again, it removes temporarily. And now let's do fixing the car of, I don't know, 21,000. And sure enough, poor sucker is in the debt of 11,000. Not debt. Yeah, so this would be it for the project, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you in the next project.